Okay, so I'm going to start the event. I'm David Gillam. I'm the director of Wales One World Film Festival. And this is the kind of dawn of a new era for us. So after 20 years of working in cinema, we're working online for the first time. And you are the lucky people to enjoy the very first Q&A and Zoom call that we've done. So, you know, fingers crossed. I would like, as is traditional at these occasions, to thank our funders. So that's Film Hub Wales and Film Cymru Wales, but most of all the Welsh Government, who have supported us through cultural recovery funding, which has meant we could offer you all tickets for free. So you are the beneficiaries of Welsh Government. You pay the taxes and you get a free ticket. It's a great system. And I'd particularly like to thank our partners here. This has been a kind of festival of festivals this year. We've got Kotatsu Japanese Animation Festival who programmed with us, and Iris, the LGBT Festival. But most of all, Aberystwyth, Aberystwyth's own horror festival. And I would really particularly like to thank Gareth Bailey, who's hiding in the shadows somewhere. This festival simply wouldn't have been possible without his tech support and all he's done over the last few weeks. So I don't know, can people do these reactions? Do people know how to do the reaction thing? And you can give Gareth a big round of applause like that. Or you can just, it's all good. It's a sort of silent clapping. This is some kind of haiku or something, you know, the sound of silent clapping. As well, I would also like to thank Tanya, who's new to our team, has been doing the social media, and we were just saying what an amazing job she's done. And again, you know, all stuff that we're learning for the first time online. And then the other part of our great team is Rowan Allen, who you can see here, who's chosen quite a lot of the films and organised a lot of the events. And she's put up with me for very many years. So that's quite a thing in itself. So I would just like to hand over to her because she's going to run the Q&A and she'll bring in our guests. So thank you, Rowan, and over to you.
Diolch, David. Noswaith dda I gyd, croeso. Welcome everybody. It's really nice to have such a lovely turnout. Not too big, not too small. So thank you all for coming. First of all, I want to give a little bit of Zoom housekeeping. For the first half of this evening, the Zoom experience is probably going to work best for you in the audience if you put yourself on speaker view, and then you'll be able to see the guests in the panel spotlighted. And then later on, so about halfway through, we'll ask you to switch to gallery view. That's for when we'll be taking questions from the floor, and we'll be able to make it a bit more interactive and hear your voices and things. So we kind of bring that, we're in the cinema, we've got a bit of community feel here going on. But we remind you when to switch to gallery view later on. You're all on mute. Please keep yourself on mute just because of background noise and disturbance, unless you need to speak, and then you can unmute yourself. We are, just a reminder, we are recording this discussion for YouTube. So if you don't want to appear in the recording, please do stop your video and stay on mute. So the next thing I'd like to do is welcome our panelists. So tonight we have Suzanne Crocker, who is the director of First We Eat. We have Morganne Goodman from Ty Coed Treehouse, a local food business in Aberystwyth. And we have our Ceredigion MP, Ben Lake, with us this evening to talk about the issues, the topics raised by the film, and to take your questions towards the end as well. Before we go into the discussion, I thought I'd just like to ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves briefly. Maybe if you could just talk about who you are, where you are, what you do. Can I come to Suzanne first, please?
Rinhozo, everybody. So I'm speaking from Dawson City in the Yukon in the north of Canada on the traditional territory of the Trondaquichin. This is what it actually looks like right now in the Yukon. We're still in the midst of beautiful winter, which is 7 or 8 months of our year. And yeah, it's really a great pleasure to be here with you. As you probably know, I'm the the filmmaker of First We Eat and also the subject of First We Eat and also the cinematographer. So I'm sure you've all figured that out by now, and I'll save comment more comments for questions. But thank you very much to the Film Festival for bringing the film and me, and it's really exciting to kind of be in a room with you virtually.
Yeah, Suzanne. Can I come round to Morganne next? If you'd like to unmute yourself and say hi.
Hello, thanks for having me here this evening. So I have the Treehouse in Aberystwyth. We're a local and organic food business. My husband and I bought the business about 2 years ago, and we're just trying to take it forward. Inherited a long-standing business in the area, looking forward to the future and what it might hold with food.
Thank you, Morganne. Come around next to Ben.
Thanks, Rowan. My name is Ben Lake. I'm the Member of Parliament for Ceredigion, and I am a Westminster MP, so a lot of the debates around food tend to be more on the trade side of things and the more system level debates, and I'm quite keen for the discussion this evening, especially how we hopefully can bring about a more localised food system, because I think not just Ceredigion but the entire country, indeed the world, needs to move to that sort of an approach for food system if we are to be sustainable.
Thanks, Ben. So I'm going to keep as close as I can to the format that we'd follow in a cinema usually for a panel discussion. So I have a question, one question each for each of the panelists. And then I'll ask the panelists if they have a burning question for each other before we open it up to the audience. Okay. So I'll go back to Suzanne first. Suzanne, you're a mother, a filmmaker, and an activist. You could have chosen, I suppose, to make a much more straightforward documentary with talking head style interviews, but instead you did something an awful lot more personal. Could you go into that a little bit more, your choices?
Well, you know, I have ideas, and when I get an idea, it's all about living the idea, I guess. And as opposed to researching this issue of food sovereignty in the North, I thought, you know, it would be the best research possible to just jump in with both feet and give it a go. And that would bring out, you know, both the benefits and the choke points if I didn't starve my family in the process or give them botulism. And so that's what I decided to do. And I think that's just kind of both my style in general in life and also in storytelling and filmmaking. So, and I was quite inspired, you know, by times past. When, like, well, prior to settlers coming to this area, of course, the indigenous people ate 100% locally off the land for thousands and thousands of years. And even when settlers first came here, which was only a little over 100 years ago, because we're quite young from a settler point of view, Dawson used to produce 97% of its own food. So over those 100 years, we've done this about flip, where now we bring in 97% of our own food. So I was inspired by knowing that it was possible and disheartened by our current situation. And that was a big impetus to say, okay, what about like now in this decade? What would it look like? What would it take if we wanted to become food sovereign again?
Thank you. Morganne, I'll come on to you next. I was wondering if after watching Suzanne's film, did you find there was much commonality between Wales and the Yukon when it comes to food issues? Are there any particular lessons we could learn, do you think, through Suzanne's film, or any messages you think that we need to get across in order to sort of grow local food systems here? Oh, you're muted.
Oh, is that better?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good question. Actually, so bringing back to what Ben said earlier, I actually think it's a lot easier to do here in Wales because we're fortunate to have a milder climate and a long history of having farmed the land is within our culture, and we know the properties of our land to be able to produce a lot more from it. I think Suzanne's work puts us to shame actually. If Suzanne can do it, then we certainly can with a lot greater ease, especially given that our population is higher. And while I'm a big advocate of local work, I think that cooperation and community participation is key to all of our success. I think that working together is what's necessary. So, for example, you know, one farm can produce a crop for several families, several, you know, people working. I think that, yeah, absolutely, we need to do better. I think I was really inspired by what you're doing, actually, Suzanne, and I think I was really I've got to bring it back to one question, actually. It's what I'm struggling with when you said that we could ask a question to one of our fellow panelists. I've got a list of dozens of questions to come back to Suzanne about.
We'll come back to them in a minute then, Morganne.
Sure.
Thank you. So Ben, as MP for Ceredigion, which is one of the UK's most rural constituencies, I'm really curious to hear what your constituents have to say on you know, the topic of local food and local food systems. Is everyone singing with the same voice? What are you hearing from them? You know, what are the concerns? What are the opportunities?
Yeah, that's a great question, because in many respects, you could say that people are of one mind on the question of, would you prefer to buy local food? You know, most people would answer yes to that. And in that sense, everybody's on the same page. Where I think there's a bit more of a job to do of explaining and educating people, let's not beat around the bush, is that a lot of the food system that we have and has developed in its current form is actually not that old. It's the product of the Common Agricultural Policy. So you're talking about 40 odd years really in its current form. We went from a system of predominantly family-based farms, smaller farms, mixed farms. And I just think of my own family and their history in agriculture. My great-grandparents would just have everything. They would grow, they would rear different animals, and maybe, I'm just thinking now of chocolate and coffee and tea, yeah, granted, they would, you know, bring that in, but everything else, more or less, was something that they either reared or grew on their own farm. Then my grandparents' generation, that started to be narrowed, if you like, and I think it's predominantly a result of policy. We now have a situation where in Wales, as much as I suppose in much of the rest of the world, you have increasingly an industry that is typified by kind of a mono-product farm, whether that's a particular animal or a particular crop. And, you know, there are reasons why that's happened, and it's a broader discussion perhaps about, you know, neoliberalism and the market. But one of the things that I think people in Ceredigion perhaps don't always realise is that what we're talking about here in terms of a local food system is, as Suzanne actually mentioned, very much a dynamic of going back to the future. And it need not be this scary unknown thing, because our grandparents would just look at it as being normal. And they certainly had a broad range of choices and enjoyed food. So I think there's on the question of would you want or would you prefer local, I think there's probably a broad consensus. But where you get a little bit more of a discord and perhaps a little bit of anxiety is, what does the alternative mean and what does it look like? And I think that's where probably people like myself, politicians, need to up their game and up our game in explaining what we mean by local food systems.
And how did those local food systems work in the past? I mean,
I think two big kind of attitudinal things that will be a challenge for a modern society. And I think that they were picked up on in Suzanne's experiences. First is that you have to be far more closely linked in terms of what you eat to the seasons. So you're eating seasonal. And You know, it sickens me to think that, and I always pick on strawberries, I don't know why, but you can walk into a store in Ceredigion, sorry, a supermarket in Geredigion, and you're almost guaranteed to be able to buy strawberries 365 days a year. I mean, that's ridiculous. You know, you shouldn't be able to do that. There's a cost to that isn't always kind of internalized and kind of in people's minds, you know, so that there's that seasonal thing, but also people had a far greater appreciation of what food was and where it came from. And I'm not just meaning, you know, that milk comes from a cow, but also the broader process behind it and the effort behind it. And I don't want to pretend that it's easy, but it's doable. And I think this question of whether it's easy or not is growing increasingly redundant by the day when you consider that the food system that we have at the moment is unsustainable, whether it's just in terms of the carbon embodied in our imports, or whether it's just as striking emergencies as soil erosion, for example, but it is not very well understood. I think if our ancestors, and I mean like our grandparents and great-grandparents, they would understand that, because they would be out there in the fields. They'd be so more closely aligned to the way that food is produced. They'd understand the importance of soil in a way that, and I'm generalizing here, right? I'm not picking on anybody, but in general, communities these days in our society don't understand and appreciate it as much. And because of that, they're almost ignorant of the consequences, which is, a massive problem for us all.
Yeah, well, soil health has real wide-ranging ramifications, doesn't it, for climate change as well as how we're growing our food. So I just wanted to now offer the chance for you panelists to ask each other questions. Morganne, you mentioned you had a long list. Is there anything that you'd like to ask Ben or Suzanne, or vice versa? Suzanne, have you got any questions for either of these two?
Okay, I think I've been refining it as I've been hearing you guys speak. So kind of following on from what you're saying, Ben, so something that we come up against in my business is when we select suppliers and we select the people that we work with, because we're fortunate to have a lot of options, is the concept of greenwashing. I don't know if any of you've heard that before, about how, so there's a limited understanding as to what is environmentally friendly, and some certain producers will use buzzwords to sell their products, which isn't necessarily as environmentally friendly as it's made out to be, or sustainable is the word that we prefer to use here in the Treehouse, because ethical is a bit, open to, subjectivity. So I guess my question was, Suzanne, I kind of was really hoping to explore further your experience of what you did on the film, of the broader picture of what you're doing. So it's entirely evident that the primary consumption that you were doing and your family were doing was local. But what I was really wondering, because in our business we've learned that it's not just about what you buy, it's about what the person you're buying from has done and how sustainable their practices are. So I was wondering about, the animal feed that was used for the animals that you were eating, or the funding for how you funded your lifestyle. Was that something that you considered in the journey as well? That was a lot of words, so that's a big question. I'll hand over to you at that point.
Yeah, and I think one of the farmers, Megan, said it well in the film, that she was talking about organic, certified organic things, and how that's helpful if you're disconnected from your food, but if you actually know your farmer, then it becomes less important to know if it's got an organic certification or not, because you have that relationship with the farmer, and you know how they treat their animals, and you know what they put in their soil, and how they feed their animals and whatnot. So yeah, that also is obviously incredibly important. And just because it's local doesn't necessarily mean it's sustainable or good. I mean, I think we're kind of speaking, when we're speaking local in this context, we're talking about local, sustainable farming, and so therefore it is good. But I guess if I lived next to a ginormous industrial pig farm in the US, it would be local, but it wouldn't necessarily be sustainable or good. So for our farmers, yeah, you know, I mean, just like food coming from far away has all kinds of issues from a shipping and a cost and a carbon footprint point of view, so it does if you have to bring in the feed and the fertilizer and all that. And so our farmers are very aware of that, and I'm very aware of it. When I was doing this project, you know, just like thinking even as far as seed, you know, like, I mean, obviously not everything that was grown from seed that was saved here, but I started to save seeds and started to understand the importance of saving seed in our community and having seed that's acclimatized to our community. And similarly with the feed for the livestock, Dan, who you saw briefly in the film, grows hay that feeds a lot of the livestock, and a lot of the livestock graze. There are a few things that the farmers have to bring in. Some they bring in from a larger grain farm in Whitehorse that's still in the Yukon, about 6 hours away. And then there's a few things that we just can't grow here. Like I think some of the protein supplements for the animals occasionally have to come from further south. So it's not perfect, but the farmers are looking at, you know, ways to grow more and more of the feed. And similarly with the fertilizer, you know, like, I mean, the wonderful advantage of mixed farms is that it's kind of like this full circle loop. So the animals fertilize the ground that the crops are grown in, and the cuttings from the crops go back to feed the animals, you know, and so it's this wonderful full circle. So all that becomes incredibly important, as you say, and there are some limitations. There's the Zoom cat to what we can produce here, but I think they're doing really well. The other thing that comes, you know, to mind is with breeding of animals. I mean, you can only inbreed your animals for so long, and then you need new breeding stock. And because we're a small territory, you know, the idea of, like, for the dairy farmers, them bringing in a bull every few years from down south is a huge deal, and then getting it across the river. So Jen, the dairy farmer, she actually has become certified in artificial insemination, and so now she gets bull in a can, as she describes it, that comes in, and that's how she can keep the herd healthy without having, you know, it's obviously easier to ship a small can of bull semen than it is to bring in a full bull every few years. So, and some of our farmers are breeding animals. Like we have a farmer who's not in the film, who's starting a nursery for boar pig cross. And so that she can also supply pigs to other people who want to raise them. So this whole full cycle thing is just so important. And I think, you know, we're working to that more and more and more, and as best that we can. Did that answer, or did I forget some part?
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I appreciate your answer.
I have a question. Well, I have a question for both of you, but Ben, I think it's great that you are on board as MP, and I wish that every place had an MP who thought like you did. But my question is, well, I have two questions for you. One, I'm just curious in Wales about the import-export, like if you even know, but how much of the food produced in Wales is actually exported instead of used locally? That's my part one. And then my part two question is, as MP, what do you think you will be able to achieve to help improve the local food ecosystem in your area?
Thanks, Suzanne. Well, on the first question, fortunately, Wales actually tends to export a lot of its food produce. Well, sorry, that's probably an oversimplification. For most of the sheep that it rears, and Wales tends to be associated a lot with sheep, a significant amount of it is exported. You know, although we have a big reputation for being sheep farmers, the typical Welsh citizen doesn't eat that much lamb. So most of it is exported. And of those exports, international exports, so not to England, but other countries, the vast majority did go to the European Union, and within that, France and Germany. The other kind of meat products, then, there does seem to be a little bit more of a domestic consumption, but it's still a very, even with beef and chicken, well, the chicken that we do produce, a lot of it goes to markets in England, actually, by kind of percentage. And then when it comes to, unfortunately, we don't grow as much in terms of wheat, barley as we used to. I mean, we have a history of it, and people forget, actually, that we've got quite a famous history of growing these crops. It's on the Ceredigion coat of arms. There's one of the highlights of the year in Cardigan where Rowan is.
Barley Saturday, yeah.
You know, and people have forgotten that element of our heritage, if you like. Primarily, and this is not being political, because Brexit's been a big issue in the UK for the last 4 or 5 years, but a lot of the financial incentives that were bedded into the European agricultural scheme really favoured those producers that just kind of concentrated on one thing and were able to mass produce that one thing. So sadly, that variety and diversity of our agricultural produce has, well, if you compare it from like 1945 to today, it seriously has kind of reduced diversity. So with that as a kind of a context, I think the biggest thing that an individual MP can do is to, on the one hand, try and challenge the default opinions when it comes to food system, because a lot of well, in my opinion, I might be wrong, actually. I'd be interested to know later on in the discussion what people think, but I often kind of come from it from point of view as we need as a society and as individuals to understand that to be sustainable, we have to be seasonal. And that sometimes means less choice. That has to be that element of an awareness that it doesn't mean that you can just have whatever you want, whichever day of the year. So having that conversation as a politician, which you're told you always have to be kind of the yes man and say positive things and things that people will agree with you on, is the big challenge. Because actually, no, this is a difficult thing to do. It's well worth doing. We'll actually probably find ourselves valuing and enjoying our food a great deal more if we were to forego the kind of capitalist market of choice is everything. But in terms of a practical thing, the best thing that an MP can do is to not try and overlook the small local things you can do now. So for example, something that we have not been doing, and I am pressurising local authorities, both kind of hospitals and the public sector in Wales, when it comes to procurement of food, they are a big player, and they could, shift markets. They could seriously send that incentive out to the market, if you like, that, okay, what we want is good quality, sustainable food. And I am pushing that as part of these kind of procurement laws, that there is a localism clause. Now, one thing that has been emphasised this evening, and I'm going to have to think on this, of course, is that local doesn't always mean good. So there has to be a refinement there of, being clear what you want to get from that local. But I think if we can at least get the procurement laws from the public sector in place, it gives you that base in changing the system a little bit, and enough to then hopefully set about a bit of a chain reaction so that individual producers will start saying, oh, actually, I can make a livelihood out of, being perhaps growing 2 or 3 different things and rearing 2 or 3 different animals, as opposed to just concentrating on the one stock or the one crop. I think that's probably all I'll be able to effectively manage. But on the national kind of UK level, and this is going to sound perhaps a little tedious and boring, but I think if we can move away from our obsession as a society with growth equals GDP, because that sets us down a line and a way of thinking that just further propagates, the capitalism kind of consumerist kind of nature of society that, in my opinion, has, that adage, it knows the cost of everything but the value of nothing. So on a national level, I'd like to try and set the UK government to move away from this obsession with GDP. It's not just the UK government thing, most Western governments have it, so I'm not picking on the UK government in this part, but if we can move away from that, and if people haven't seen it yet, there's an important piece of work, the Dasgupta Review, which is worth looking at, which is starting on that journey of taking a more holistic approach as to what do we mean by growth and value. And then on the local level, procurement laws. I think those are my two kind of priorities at the moment to try and turn the ship around.
That's wonderful. I think those are both really key for sure. And the procurement, especially to, ultimately would help make local food more affordable and more accessible for everybody, which is great. And Morganne, I just have a question for you. I think it's amazing what your business is doing, providing that food hub and convenience between the producer and the consumer. And I wonder if there's any opportunity in your business or in other businesses where you are to deal with the value added issue. Like we were speaking a little bit before everybody came in, that if all the farmers, I mean, here, I don't know how it is there, but here, broccoli all grows at the same time for all the farmers. So then there's more broccoli than our community can eat when the broccoli is there. But if there's ways to flash freeze that so it's available 6 months later, or to process that so it's available as broccoli soup and then frozen, and available throughout the winter, then that glut of broccoli can all be used throughout the year. And does your business have that ability, or are there other businesses nearby that have that ability?
So to a small extent, we are doing that. And there is a really, really good organisation in Aberystwyth called the Aber Food Surplus that do what they can with processing waste foods and distributing that at low costs. I think there is a real want in our community to reduce food waste and to have that community feel towards how we're eating. So it's actually a very important part of our business plan that added value products is so with I mentioned earlier, we have a plot, we grow, we pay a salary, and we run a lot of volunteers to be able to use that plot to provide our shop with goods, and we still make a heavy loss on it. And as an important part of to make it at least break even is to have another kitchen that we can create additional value added products to utilize and better distribute those products. We do already have a kitchen here in our shop, and that kitchen makes soup and baked goods out of our wasted vegetable products. So that's obviously quite a short-term turning over of excess products, but it's a very important part of our business. Again, our chefs, a very expensive resource in our business, but we would never get rid of them because of the waste aspect. One of our key values is we're very close to it, is working towards zero waste. But infrastructure is key. Because of the nature of our business, it's very low profit. It's very expensive to make food and to distribute food because of the competitive nature of factory produced, mass produced, heavily, bad for you and bad for the environment food. That's what we're competing against. And we pay our chefs good wages to make soup, which is a very low value product. So our intention is, and we are on the way to doing it, is to improving the infrastructure so that we can better utilize the products that are available to us. And as I mentioned earlier, we get in Ceredigion, certain crops grow particularly well. So all of our growers will bring us, more courgettes than the whole community can eat within 1 month and nothing for the rest. But if we had a massive kitchen then we could make products that would last throughout the year. So infrastructure is what we're missing, and resources. But yes, it's a very important part of what we are doing and aim to improve.
Can I invite Ben to comment on that last point of infrastructure?
Yeah, that's one of the things actually that struck me in your film, Suzanne, as well, was just how much planning and capacity you need to be able to do it on a community level. And I appreciate, what Morganne just said there about, you have that glut of courgettes, and then if you can't freeze them or to store them or to do something to them that they can, last longer, it's almost as though you run into a kind of a food equivalent of the boom and bust. I think it's an idea that has literally just come to me, but I'm just, there's a lot of public kind of investment in the current food system in other ways, whether it's the indirect kind of procurement of foods that are produced by the system, or whether it's certain subsidies or grants that certain businesses get for continuing and propagating the current system. And actually, there could be a very good argument and a case to be made for, I'm thinking my head on my feet here, but some sort of a food kind of storage and local food storage, and kind of processing capacity, but publicly owned. And I think with one of the experiences of COVID, of course, is that it has brought people in a weird and perverse way actually closer together, even though we're distant physically. There's, I see a lot more people now on Zoom than I would in normal times, even if I was able to see them in person. And there is a greater appetite, I feel, for kind of coordination and organisation on a very local level, whether that is, the street that makes sure that the elderly have a bit of company over the garden fence and make sure that the prescriptions are collected, or more kind of village level and town level even. And so there could be an opportunity there actually for a lot of that storage, because it's capital intensive. There's quite a big upfront cost to create that. That's perhaps where the state, and by that I mean kind of maybe Welsh Government level, could come in, offer that basic level of capital infrastructure, but then for it to be run and used and maintained on a more local level. Because that's one of the things I'm very keen to try and avoid, is this idea that everything has to be London kind of down or Cardiff down. I actually think a lot of these things have to come from the ground up if they are to be long lasting and effective. So when it comes to the point you made there, Morganne, I think actually there's a very good argument. We have in decades, we would have community infrastructure in the sense of community halls or we invest in theatres and what have you. But maybe why don't we take that one step further and think about sustainable food production, storage? Could we, Sorry, I'm thinking on my feet there, but I don't know.
Do you mind if I
Sorry, I'm just going to say the old technology of the root cellar is incredibly valuable.
I totally agree with everything you said there, Ben, by the way. I think one thing that I'd like you to consider, or that should be considered, is the skill set that food preservation requires. I think actually education, you mentioned earlier about education, but so for example, fermentation, which is a very nutritious way to, we've talked about, cold storage, we talked about freezing, we've talked about dehydrating, and all these lovely techniques that we had Suzanne teaching us about, and I'm sure that she's dabbled in a lot of fermentation as well in her time, and she can vouch for the skill set that requires to get right. You're a biochemist when you're a fermenter. I think that there's a lot of opportunity to create highly skilled jobs. Another point that Suzanne made about food knowledge being undervalued. I think we need to put some emphasis and some financing into our education systems as well to prepare for this kind of, it's not just a case of infrastructure, it's a case of we need to have the skill set and the people able to do it as well. Like one thing that I can see about Aber Food Surplus, they've got a lot of drive to do what they do and not a lot of skill. And I feel like they, you know, together we could do more if we had more infrastructure and more skill. I'll finish there.
Thanks, Morganne. I think this is about the point where I'd love to hear from the audience. I'd love to hear your points of view, your questions. So if you switch to gallery view, and if you have a question or something you would like to chip in with, raise your hand and Reese will come back and join us and call out your name and spotlight you and unmute you.
Hey, there's quite a few people. I've seen Carol's got her hand up. Carol, do you want to unmute and I'll spotlight you? Well, actually, I've unmuted you. There you go.
Right, thank you. I just want to put in a word about the Lampeter Permaculture Group and other related groups. The concentration on food preservation is quite strong within that group because all of us grow food. Well, I think we all do. All of us suffer from considerable gluts. I can remember having 2 barrow loads of broad beans on 1 week. You've got to find ways of keeping that food or distributing it, one or the other. And we have quite a number of people in the group who are quite expert at fermentation. We have a seed library, which is getting larger than the original permaculture group. And a sort of subsection of our membership are working with the college in Lampeter to create a sustainability college at Lampeter, which will be a way of attempting to return to some kind of greater emphasis on local food production and sustainability. But I want to just put a word of warning in here. 8 years, no, more than that, 2012, I was at the National Eisteddfod in Bro Morgannwg and helping to run a stall, basically extolling the virtues of the permacultural way of, the holistic view of running the land. And we had a lot of conversations with people who just about remember doing it the same way when they were children. And I often asked them, well, we ought to go back to this, shouldn't we? And they said, no, not likely. What do I want to do with that? There's too much hard work. There is a very, very strong disincentive in our present system against going back to that level of, or if you call it going back, going forward to that level of commitment. I think I better stop there.
Thanks, Karen. So I think I can see Gwenda's hand up. So Reese is going to unmute you, Gwenda.
I think you can speak now, Gwenda.
Okay. Yes, I'd like to add to that what Carol was saying about storage, because, with global warming, this is going to get worse. I'm a fruit grower and potato grower and used to store in the basement. And this year, I don't think the temperature dropped below 14 degrees in the basement. So that gets quite critical, really. Since it really needs to be at least down to 9, but better 6 or so. So I've got plans to actually try and get a cold store together. And so, yes, absolutely, it's getting more and more vital as we get climate change to be making, not to be hanging around doing this either. These are critical things to get that infrastructure in place. And, I'm in St. Ogmell's here, and we have a community project that's been running for a few years, the Orchard Project. So there's now a lot of people invested in fruit. And we could really make a whole fruit community here. But we really need that infrastructure. And, you know, also in Aberystwyth, we have a lot of animal husbandry. And just in the last few years, the abattoir went. I mean, that is just a terrible thing for, you know, the health of the local animals and the condition of the animals that we eat. So that sort of thing desperately needs to be addressed. So yes, I'm very encouraged by what Ben was saying about needing that infrastructure. And I think we've really got to do it soon.
Thanks, Gwen.
I think there's a question from Daniel as well. I'll spotlight him and unmute.
I was interested, Suzanne, you know, looking at the various producers that you had up in Dawson City and around there, that, you know, they were really working hard and almost sometimes to the point of whether it was sustainable for them. I guess food prices are a lot higher in that part of the world because of the import cost, and we don't have that premium. I'm somebody, we've grown here I'm a grower. I'm kind of stepping back from that because just economically for myself, it's just, you know, financial suicide, really, to try and produce vegetables for local markets. You know, I've done markets in the local town and, you know, got up at 5 o'clock in the morning and dug and washed the veg and things like that and produced local food for the local community. But, you know, it's physically, economically very, very difficult. So, you know, I've often had this point that's been raised of infrastructure. You know, I'm you know, there's lots of talk about the share economy now of sharing infrastructure, and I noticed with the mobile abattoir that there was quite an expensive bit of kit to sort of like process the wild boar there, and I was wondering whether that was subsidized by the state or you know, that seemed a bit of share economy, you know, a bit of kit. And I think, you know, a lot of people, when they think about growing, they think about doing it all manually, but I think we could produce a lot if there was specialized bits of kit which are shared, which, you know, take away the time. You know, I saw the pictures of you sorting the grain in your attic, and you know that's something I saw from what you were doing, is that it was taking you forever to do that, and you know, there, to go sustainable, we need to take that time out and use, at least allow people that have the passion to do this, you know, support them to not just take up their whole lives kind of sorting grains and things, and be able to deliver more, you know. So that's what came out, and it's nice that Ben's kind of reflected that with the need for infrastructure, and you know, and Morganne's raised that as well. So yeah.
Yeah, and it's great that Ben's on the panel listening to a grower say that you're going to have to leave growing because it's not economically or time feasible or sustainable, which is, you know, so unfortunate. And how do we shift that? But you're right. I mean, our farmers here are passionate about what they do, as most growers are, because they're passionate about what they do and they believe in it, not because they, you know, it's an easy life and they're happy to have no holidays, and not because they're making a lot of money. But yes, some of those infrastructures and subsidies to the small growers are so vital. Like, I mean, it's crazy that so much subsidy goes to the huge industrial farms and so little to the smaller farms, when really the smaller farms are so much more valuable for us. And the mobile abattoir, for sure, it is funded by the territory of the Yukon, so by the government. And it's essential. I think, as somebody else was mentioning about losing the abattoir in their community, like, I mean, that just, that just takes away so many opportunities for retail. I mean, it's okay to buy, half a pig farm gate, but who has the ability to store half a pig or a pig in their house or apartment? I mean, you saw in the film, 5 freezers and plus a great outdoors for freezing things. Like, that's just not feasible for most people. So yeah, these things are critical in our community as well. Like, that abattoir currently only comes to our community 1 week a year. It can only process, I think, like, 6 to 10 pigs in a day. And so our farmers have the capability to produce more and to provide more local meat for our community, but we need the abattoir to be here more often, or we need a fixed abattoir in our community. So that's what currently our livestock farmers are coming together and lobbying and trying to figure out ways to make that happen. So common hurdles and problems, whether this side of the pond or your side of the pond. And I'm really glad that Ben's here to listen, because it takes ground up, but it also takes high level understanding and making the change, working together.
I believe Sarah and Ulrich both have questions. So Sarah, I'll come to you first, and then Ulrich, I'll come to you.
Unmute myself, yeah?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Okay. Morganne, Suzanne, I've just watched the film before I sat down to do this session, and I was so struck by the amount of meat that there was around, because I think eating locally depends on the sort of diversity, and the problem that I think we've got here in the UK, it's a small country, really, very small country, and we've got a large population. So if everybody is to eat meat, then the response has been to breed more animals in sheds. So, you've lost the idea of the farmer as a conservator of the countryside, and the idea of a natural balance. It's all gone, because animals are just in sheds now. All sorts of animals are being produced in sheds in order to meet this need of the public to eat meat. So of course there's another way of looking at this, and that is to say, I think it's an extraordinary percentage, something like 80% of the land. People will tell me if I've got this wrong, but 80% of our land, agricultural land, is used on either meat or the production of foodstuffs for meat, whereas we should be using that to grow more vegetables and more pulses, more cereals, where we could also get more protein. And I know this is a different response, because obviously your country is huge. It is enormous. I couldn't believe some of the statistics you were giving us, and the amount of time it takes to go anywhere and do anything. But is it normal for your family and your community to eat that much meat? Because we've already started cutting down here in the UK.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. To me, this brings up the issue of one of the things I love about thinking local is that then you aren't looking at one solution for every place in the world. What works for you in Wales is different than what works for us in this part of Canada. So like in this part of Canada where I live, we don't have the growing season to produce any kind of protein that's not animal based. So we can't grow, like I gathered every sunflower that grew in my community that year, hoping that I could get sunflower seeds. And the few numbers of sunflowers that actually went to seed amounted to about 1/4 of a cup. And that's like cutting sunflowers down from everybody's gardens and churchyards and whatnot. And one of our farmers tried to grow chickpeas, and they could only really grow in his greenhouse. And he has a huge greenhouse, and for the huge volume of space they took up, I maybe got a cup of chickpeas. So, and grains are incredibly difficult to grow here. It's possible, our farmers are doing it, but it's not, I'm sure not like it is in Wales. So, you know, for our part of the world, all our protein has to be animal based, and that's what makes sense for where we live. And so, like, I used to be vegetarian, but, you know, now when I think about that, I think, okay, so does it make sense for me to import legumes and soy and nuts from halfway across the world when I don't know how they're raised? I don't know about the pesticide use on them. I don't know if it's monoculture. Or does it make more sense for me in this part of the world to eat meat when I know how it's raised, I know what it's fed, or the wild meat I know has a totally natural good life until it's harvested? So I think there's not one, you know, one brush for one solution for all. And of course, I'm not for industrialized meat systems where animals are crammed in and fattened up just to feed us. And I understand both the environmental impact of that, but I think it's different in every community. So that's what I love about thinking local.
Thanks. I think, Ulrich, if you got a question, I'll spotlight you now.
Hey, actually, I was going to ask you about, you know, whether you still eat meat, because you did mention in your film that you had, you know, that you were vegetarian before. But something that interests me as well is is the scalability. Obviously, you kind of mentioned, you know, how much you had to put into gathering enough for your family. Now, I don't know what the density of population is in your region. Would it actually be possible with all the people who live there, if everybody bought into the idea, to produce enough food for a healthy diet for everybody who lives there currently?
I definitely wanted to extrapolate when I did this project for my community. And yes, it is possible for my community. Now, my community of Dawson City is like 2,000 people. So it's small. And as you saw, we have a lot of space, not that all that space is you know, potential agriculture space. But I did speak to the farmers about this, you know, and thinking about if the whole community decided to go this way, could they scale up in order to provide enough? And I also spoke to our conservation officers about the sustainability of the wildlife here, you know, like, would we decimate our moose and caribou population if that was the case? And the conclusion was that it is sustainable for our population in this part of the world. And it would mean, like, we couldn't do it overnight, of course, like it would have to be a gradual scaled up solution. And we would have to think about eating in more moderation. So not necessarily leaving the table, you know, fully stuffed, but eating a bit differently. And also the other thing that I learned in this experience was just how far food goes, both meat and vegetable, when you're using all parts. So normally we would say in the Yukon that 2 moose will feed a family for a year, supply meat for, or no, sorry, 1 moose will feed 2 families enough meat for a year. And that's just thinking about the roasts and the steaks and the burger. But when you start looking at eating all parts of the moose and the nutrition in the bone from boiling up the bones for bone broth and the bone marrow and all the organs, and as you saw, even like the nose, and we made this amazing pastrami out of the moose tongue. And when you looking at all parts of the animal, like, I think that 1 moose would probably feed 3 or 4 families for a year. And similarly with the raised meat. And then also with the vegetables, you know, like, you know, the idea of using the celery leaves, not just the celery, and that just, like, that just keeps going on and on and on. And when, in my case, when every morsel of food was so precious, because it was finite because I didn't have this kind of facade of an endless supply, of an endless variety of food through the grocery store to turn to. And I didn't know if I had gathered enough to last for my family. Every morsel became very precious. And so everything is used, you know, like you make the cheese and then the whey from the cheese goes to boil the potatoes, and then that goes to make the soup stock, and on and on and on it goes. And when you're thinking that way, when you're not pouring stuff down the drain or letting things rot in the back of the fridge because it's being ignored because the next grocery cart of food is coming in, then food goes much farther. So yes, in my community, I think it would be sustainable, and I suspect we could probably do it for all of the Yukon. I mean, the Yukon only has 43,000 people. It, of course, becomes more difficult in bigger populations, but then you look at, you know, like I've looked at research, you know, about urban farming and urban gardens, and there's some amazing statistics out there, like in China, you know, like Shanghai, you know, within the city producing 85% of its produce within the city itself. So between, you know, making use of spaces instead of for ornamental shrubs, but, you know, for things that are edible, and using rooftops and vertical spaces and empty lots and raised beds in backyards, even in populated cities, there's so much more food that we can be producing. And I feel like the pandemic, like when I made this film originally, I thought, how is anybody outside of the North going to find this relatable? They're all going to think, oh, well, this makes sense for you in the North because you're so remote and you're so far away. And now, of course, since the pandemic happened, I don't worry about that at all, because we've all realized of the vulnerabilities of long supply chains and long food chains. And how important it is in a time of crisis to be able to rely on our own communities, because that's where we have to turn to in times of crisis. So wouldn't it be great, whether we're urban or rural, if we maximize the amount of food, sustainable food that we can produce, so that in the next crisis, you know, maybe we can't have the chocolate or the coffee or the avocado or the banana, but those are the luxury items and the staples that we need to feed ourselves, whether that be just the meat and the potatoes or whatever it is our geography can produce, that we can do that within our own communities.
Sorry, I need to unmute. Thank you, Suzanne. I think that's a really apt way to conclude tonight's discussion, which I'm sure could have gone on for another hour at least, but it is just gone 10 o'clock. I'd like to, before we do conclude though, just ask Morganne to come in again as a local Ceredigion producer and food business. Are there any sort of final thoughts that you'd like to give us from tonight's session?
Stop processing all the amazing things I've heard tonight, but I mean, I think I'm privileged to be in a position that I'm exposed to a lot of people's opinions. You know, our customers are really too happy to tell us what they think about our values and the community's values and how we can improve on that. That coupled with, you know, a degree in plant biology, I think, furthering on from Suzanne's point, what we maybe haven't discussed so much tonight is modernization of food systems. There's actually been a lot of developments made. There's a lot of hypothetical ideas that we can put into practice to, you know, like Suzanne said, with urbanizing our food systems, but also with optimizing our yields in a more sustainable way. It's pooling resources, isn't it? It's using the modern, you know, it's using technology to our advantage. There's still a lot more potential to benefit from the earth without harming it. And the more that we have learned from the mistakes that we've made with industrialization and put this into practice to try and negate global warming, there's a lot of potential, is what I'm saying. I think I have a lot of optimism about what we still can achieve. And I think that we can keep our food local and eat locally in a healthy and sustainable way.
Thank you very much for sharing all of that, Morganne. I've got a few things before I thank the panelists that I'd like to give a quick plug before everybody disappears this evening. One thing is tonight's event is part of a strand of green screen events. So we will have a discussion tomorrow with David on Fukushima, remembering Fukushima. We have several forests related events, so do have a look at those if you're not already booked in. The other thing is the Aber Food Hub, so which has been set up in response to the pandemic by Aberystwyth Farmers Market. They've actually put together a treat box for the festival, and so you can order a hamper of Ceredigion treats made by local producers, so Cardigan Bay honey, Tregroes waffles, crusts even are represented in there. You can get organic apple juice. So do look that up if you're looking for something to eat and drink alongside watching the movies. I think David perhaps has a few more things to say before we thank our guests and thank everyone for coming tonight.
Do I? I mean, I think it's 10 o'clock and time to thank our guests, really. I mean, you know, the program's up there online. There are lots and lots of really good events, and it's really great to see this start with so many people here and to hear so many different opinions. So I think it's been a really interesting hour, but for me, it's time for bed. So, you know, I think let's thank our guests from all the way over in the Yukon, you know, come all this way.
Would everybody like to unmute themselves and perhaps give a round of applause for this evening? Thank you very much for Suzanne, for your wonderful film, which I've had so many positive glowing messages today from audience members, friends and family. Thank you, Morganne, for giving up your evening, and Ben too.
Yeah,
I'm sure you're extremely busy, but
really
we've been very supported by you, so thank you.
An inspiration.
Everybody, thank you. Wonderful to be able to join you from all the way from the Yukon. And great initiatives that are in the works in Wales.